During the Falklands War, a British parachute battalion of around 500 men was ordered to assault over open ground an Argentine position defended by more than twice that number. In this video, we're going to reconstruct the Battle of Goose Green in unprecedented detail to tell the story of the Falkland War's biggest, longest, and perhaps most remarkable land battle. The assault on Goose Green came about after the British landing on the Falklands at San Carlos on May 21st, 1982, which came at the end of a lengthy naval campaign. For the next 4 days, British ships were under a fearsome bombardment by Argentine aircraft as they unloaded troops and equipment. The warships Ardent, Antelope and Coventry were lost, along with the merchant ship Atlantic Conveyor, which was carrying helicopters vital to the mobility of the troops. These relentless Argentine attacks created political pressure in London for the ground troops to get on the front foot and make some tangible progress towards the liberation of the islands as quickly as possible. The problem was the loss of Conveyor's helicopters, which prevented the British from moving its troops east to assault the Falklands capital Stanley quickly. Instead, many of its battalions would have to walk there over miles of incredibly rough terrain, and this would take time. This left Goose Green, the Falklands' second largest settlement, as the only objective that could be secured relatively quickly. This map, by the way, is actually our new poster on the Falklands War, which you can find over on the Historigraph website. It covers all aspects of the conflict, both at sea and on land, and I think is a really good resource for anyone interested in this part of history. It'd mean the world if you checked it out. I've cut out the middleman this time, so the price is much lower than the Historigraph posters of old, and every penny from the sale goes to support the content rather than helping somebody else's profit margin. Anyway, Goose Green is located to the south of the British landing area, and so on the afternoon of May 26th, 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, hereafter referred to as 2 Para, was moved from its position at the southern edge of the British line and marched south to prepare to assault an Argentine position around the settlement. Awaiting the Paras was a reinforced battalion under Colonel Italo Piaggi, named Task Force Mercedes. It was a mix of units from 3 different Argentine battalions, supported by 6 105mm guns and several hundred Air Force personnel who had been responsible for maintaining the airfield in the area. The British commander, Colonel H. Jones, faced the daunting prospect of taking his battalion across open ground to attack a numerically superior enemy that was holding prepared positions and had more artillery support than he did. 2 Para was able to call on 3 105mm guns plus naval gunfire from the frigate HMS Arrow, but the latter was only available during the hours of darkness. To make matters worse, as 2 Para prepared for its attack, on May 27th, the Ministry of Defence jumped the gun and briefed the BBC that British troops were heading towards Goose Green, a fact which the corporation then reported publicly. In their eagerness to show a domestic audience that Britain was on the front foot, the government and the public broadcaster had tipped the Argentines off. Luckily for them, Lieutenant Colonel Piaggi didn't believe a word of what he was hearing. The Argentine commander told the historian Martin Middlebrook after the war that he thought the broadcast was a psychological action because it would be crazy for them to announce an actual move. 2 Para spent May 27th a few miles north of Goose Green. They prepared for a night attack to mitigate the open terrain they would have to advance over. Colonel Jones outlined a plan that would see the battalion attack and overrun the main area of high ground to the north and west of the Goose Green airfield before the sun came up, and then force the Argentines to surrender. Meanwhile, Task Force Mercedes awaited developments. Piaggi kept the bulk of his forces close to Goose Green itself, sending 2 platoons forward under 1st Lieutenant Manresa as the first line of defence against any attack from the north. Then, they waited. The attack on Goose Green began at 3:30 AM on May 28th. The first British unit to encounter any opposition was Major John Crosland's B Company, which soon made contact with Manresa's western platoon. They made steady, if slow progress, supported by artillery and intermittent naval gunfire from HMS Arrow, which was battling a fault with its firing system. The Argentines were forced back, with some surrendering and others retreating south. To the west, Major Farrah Hockley's A Company slipped by Manresa's line without incident, on its way to clear a suspected Argentine position at Coronation Point further south. Coming up behind both of these was D Company under Major Phil Neame, which attacked Manresa's remaining positions. They successfully cleared the Argentines out, but this phase of the battle had taken longer than expected. By 5 AM, the British were much further north than they had planned, and daylight was fast approaching. The delays had given Lieutenant Colonel Piaggi time to react. As the British attack unfolded, he ordered platoons under Lieutenants Guillermo Aliaga and Roberto Esteves to reinforce a line of trenches that had been dug in high ground west of the tiny settlement of Darwin, which until now had been held only by a platoon under Lieutenant Ernesto Pelufo. These units were soon in place, joined by around 40 men from Manresa's company that had managed to retreat, creating a sizable force that the British were not expecting in that location. Not long after 5 AM, Farrah Hockley reached Coronation Point but found no enemy forces there. After a delay to enable Colonel Jones to come across and confer with his company commander, A Company was ordered to advance to Darwin Hill with 2 platoons at speed, while 1 remained in a supporting position where they were. First light was now just minutes away. The Paras ran south as the sky began to lighten in an unplanned ad hoc advance as fast as they could. Lieutenant Coe's 2 platoon was in the lead, intending to progress up an overgrown gorse gully and then swing up onto Darwin Hill. Corporal Tom Camp led the forwardmost section of Coe's platoon. As they approached the entrance of a gully, the light gradually improved until it suddenly revealed Argentinian soldiers on top of the hill. As dawn broke, the British soldiers legged it for the gully under enthusiastic but inaccurate fire from the Argentine conscripts above. Behind them, the remainder of 2 platoon and most of 1 platoon sprinted forwards, trying to get close enough to the base of the hill that they couldn't be seen before making their way round to the others. A short action was then fought to clear out the only Argentine trench that directly overlooked the gully, stabilising what was still a very precarious situation. Farrah Hockley assessed his options. They were much too close to the enemy to call for artillery support, and thick fog at sea prevented any air support from taking off. Instead, he ordered an attack by Lieutenant Coe up the gully to try and get behind the closest trenches, but the Paras received a withering hail of fire from Argentines further west when they tried this. Observing events from his command post to the north, Lieutenant Colonel Jones was soon frustrated at the lack of progress, so decided to go forward himself to take charge of the situation. He took his headquarters south, gathered up a few A Company strays that hadn't been able to make it to the gully, and then legged it across 100 metres of open ground under the cover of a few smoke grenades. He reached A Company around 8:30 AM, still pinned down with Argentine artillery fire now falling close by. Jones was determined to get Farrah Hockley moving again, and quickly. He ordered another major attack up the hill, and when that failed with 3 men killed, Jones decided to have a go himself. Taking a small detachment, he set off at speed around the base of the hill, hoping to surprise the defenders on the other side. He ran so quickly that those behind struggled to keep up, and could only provide covering fire as Jones assaulted the first trench he came to. He took its occupants completely by surprise, but as he ran up the slope he was exposed to the Argentine trenches on the hill behind him. A burst of machine gun fire rang out and cut 2 Paras commanding officer down. For the next 15 minutes, A Company troops fought to reach Jones's location. The trench that had hit him was neutralised by an anti-tank rocket, but by the time they managed to retrieve the wounded colonel, it was too late. Colonel Jones died soon afterwards and would be posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Though coming at a high cost, it was this action that opened the door for A Company. It turned out that the hostile trench that had been destroyed was the same one that was putting lethal fire down across to the top of the gully, and its removal allowed 2 platoons to take higher ground, getting better firing positions. The battle for Darwin Hill began to turn. With the demise of Colonel Jones, 2 Paras' second in command, Major Chris Keeble, was soon in control of the battalion. With reports from Farrah Hockley improving, he chose to deploy his reserves on the right flank, where Crosland had been making very slow progress just north of Bocker House. Keble ordered Neame to come forward and flank along the coast, and directed the support company's anti-tank platoon to help with their Milan rockets, taking note of how effective these smaller handheld launchers were proving on Darwin Hill. On the Argentine side, Colonel Piaggi called for airstrikes. 2 Pucará aircraft soon arrived from Stanley, and one of them shot down a Gazelle helicopter trying to reach and evacuate casualties. At around midday, A Company was able to decisively gain the upper hand in its battle with Lieutenant Esteves' platoon. Esteves himself was killed holding his ground as his position was overrun, and just like Colonel Jones, he was decorated by his country. With the eastern high ground now in British hands, Argentine trenches immediately to the west held by Pelufo were in an untenable position, especially after the Milan started firing from the north. After a direct hit on one of his positions, the Argentine officer surrendered. This just left the platoon under Lieutenant Aliaga, which did likewise once it was clear that the Paras held an overwhelming local superiority. The main Argentine defensive line was now broken, and Colonel Piaggi's force was reeling. He was happy to be reinforced at lunchtime by a platoon helicoptered in from Stanley under Lieutenant Vasquez. These new arrivals were pressed into what remained of the Argentine line, being sent north to hold a position around the schoolhouse. To the west was another platoon under Lieutenant Gomez Centurion and troops garrisoning the airfield, where 6 20mm anti-aircraft guns provided significant firepower, along with 2 35mm guns at Goose Green itself, which could dominate the school position. The British meanwhile were keen to keep pushing forwards, to avoid giving their opponents a chance to recover. Major Keble ordered Neame and Major Hugh Jenner's C Company to continue the offensive southeast, while Crosland and B Company wheeled around to the west to complete an encirclement of Goose Green. It was a risky plan. The Paras would be attacking over more open ground straight into the face of the enemy guns. C Company went into the attack but was swiftly under heavy cannon fire from the anti-air guns, slowing their progress and inflicting casualties. D Company meanwhile made its way southeast, with 10th Platoon advancing to a deserted Argentine position at the northern edge of the airfield, where they were engaged by heavy machine gun fire, forcing them to scramble into nearby trenches for cover. The source of the fire turned out to be their own support company, which was firing from extreme range on Darwin Hill and was having difficulty telling friend from foe. Jenner and Neame were now becoming embroiled in fighting at the eastern end of the Argentine line. The 2 British companies had inadvertently ended up almost on top of each other, with their platoons intermingled. The fighting was tough and progress slow. The position at the school remained especially stubborn as the 35mm anti-air guns provided significant supporting fire. At around 3 PM, Argentine air attacks returned, with 2 Aramaki and 2 Pucará aircraft. One of each was shot down, while napalm bombs landed just 50 metres away from 10 Platoon's position on the airfield. It was a lucky escape. Half an hour later, 3 British Sea Harriers arrived, with the sea fog having finally lifted enough for them to fly. They attacked the 20mm anti-air guns on the airfield with good effect, and Argentine resistance weakened. Piaggi's men began to pull back into Goose Green itself, losing the last good defensive position available to them. By 5 PM, the Paras were only 400 yards from their final objective. 20 minutes later, there was a last-ditch attempt to reinforce Task Force Mercedes when 140 men under Captain Corsiglia landed by helicopter to the south of Goose Green, but it was too little, too late. By the time Corsiglia's men arrived at Piaggi's HQ, it was dark, and there was little hope of putting together an effective defence. Despite having put up strong resistance all day, the situation was now dire for Colonel Piaggi. Facing an ultimatum threatening a large air and artillery bombardment at first light, he felt he had little choice but to surrender, which he did on the morning of May 29th. In a day of fighting, 55 Argentines had died and 86 wounded, with around 1,000 or so now taken prisoner by the British, including several hundred Air Force personnel. The British lost 18 dead and 40 wounded, but had achieved a remarkable victory. The victory at Goose Green secured the British southern flank and was a much needed morale boost for the British public. Before long, British forces reached the area around Stanley and set up for a series of tough battles to break Argentine defences in the area. The end of the Falklands War was at hand. If you want to learn more about it, we have a documentary covering the whole war, as well as the poster I showed off earlier on. Please do have a look. Cutting out the middleman meant printing them up front, so I have several hundred of these sat in my attic ready to go to a loving home. Thank you for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time.